Welcome to Cosmopolitics. Thank you so much for joining us. There's been so much going on in the world, particularly here in the Western Hemisphere. And so, oh God, so many of you are joining on. It's really nice to see everybody. Um, so I couldn't think of anyone better to talk about everything that's going on than my good friend Tom Shannon. Tom has had maybe every important job at the State Department. I think I met you. Were you running the Andes? Did you
Correct.
run the Andes desk? Andes, which is like the whole area around Venezuela, Peru, Colombia. Then he took on ambassador to Brazil, assistant secretary for the Western Hemisphere, undersecretary for political affairs and consular to the department across many administrations, and then even secretary of state for a few days. Is that right? So I can't think of anyone better to talk about all these things. And this is his first Substack Live. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
So let's start talking about Venezuela and then we'll branch out a little bit because I know everyone wants to hear everything. The news today is about Greenland and this president going to Davos today. You served as assistant secretary of state for Western Hemisphere and U.S. ambassador to Brazil. So, your real core expertise is in this region. Um, talk to us about, what you've seen over the years, and is there anything comparable to what happened in Venezuela with the U.S.? I mean, it's not that the U.S. hasn't tried to get rid of leaders in the past, but the way that Maduro was kind of snatched and grabbed, set that in scene for what you've seen in the region.
Well, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be with you, Elise, and thank you very much. And I appreciate all who have joined, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time. In historical terms, the only thing in our hemisphere that comes close is the military operation that eventually captured Noriega. But at that time, Noriega really wasn't. Um, and it took an invasion of sorts. The military raid in Caracas, very precise, very quick, and in that sense, there is no. But in terms of snatching someone who was effectively in charge of a country, the only precedent, recent precedent, is the operation.
All right. Well, the administration had said this is about counter narcotics originally, preventing Venezuelan migration, the cartels, they're terrorists. But then the president was more explicit and said this is about energy. We need that for ourselves. So when you hear about, the switching kind of rationale, like what do you think the main objective was here?
I think we're still working that out. It's important to understand a bit of the history here because, in one way or another, President Trump has been Nicolas Maduro's trail for almost 10 years, really since the beginning of his first administration. When he struggled to understand how was it possible that a country like Venezuela, with its extraordinary oil and gas reserves and a democratic history, a constitutional history, could find itself locked in a bitter internal political conflict and become the object of external interests that were counter to U.S. interests in a way that had turned Venezuela into an adversary. And he had been looking for ways to solve this problem really since the beginning of his very first term. And he'd been kind of running through different, first pursuing diplomatic options through the Lima Group, then turning to regime change when he recognized then President of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, as the legitimate leader of Venezuela, then using maximum economic pressure campaign, then attempting to incite rebellion within the armed forces. Then, of course, he leaves office. President Biden comes in, attempts to negotiate a deal with the Maduro regime. that would lead to elections. Although the elections are held, the results of the elections are not recognized by President Maduro and those around him. And so that fails. So when President Trump comes to office in his second term, the first thing he tries to do is negotiate a way forward with Maduro, uh, his special envoy, Rick Grinnell, and focusing on the oil and gas sector and on deportations to Venezuela of Venezuelans in the United States. But he quickly realizes that that's a political non-starter in the United States because of political interests in the U.S. Congress. And so he has to step away from that. And this is when he turns to military pressure and he brings the Gerald R. Ford into the Caribbean. And at this point, you're almost on a shoot towards some kind of military intervention. You just can't move those kinds of assets into a region and just have them parade around.
There has to be some kind of denouement.
There has to be some kind of end to this. But I think the president quickly realizes that to a certain extent he's trapped in the sense that if he moves against Maduro, he has to do it in a way that doesn't involve a larger commitment to Venezuela, because what he wants to avoid is an Iraq. And this leads to the raid itself, which is actually a very daring raid and a very close run thing. And although from all outside appearances, it was quick, it was precise, it was very violent, and it achieved its purpose, it almost came undone, if not for the heroism of the helicopter pilots, many of whom were wounded in the raid. But setting that aside, and setting aside, the extraordinary nature of the raid itself, the president, once he had Maduro in his grasp and safely secured in a prison in New York, suddenly faced the challenge of, okay, what next? And it's then that he makes what I think is a fateful decision, which is a decision to work with the remnants of the regime.
Yeah.
He's act that he's just removed their leader. And instead of turning to the Democratic opposition, instead of turning to Maria Corina Machado and Gonzalez Urrutia and others, he instead turns to Delcy Rodriguez, Nicolas Maduro's vice president. And this is when he says that the United States will be running Venezuela. This is when he says that what we're really interested in is the oil and gas, ensuring that we have a compliant regime in Caracas that will permit access to oil and gas for American companies and begin to align Venezuela's behavior in ways that are consonant with U.S.
Well,
And
square something for me, okay? And you served in Venezuela under Chavez, right?
correct, first with Rafael Caldera and then Chavez when
Okay,
he's elected in
so
'98.
he has this bee in his bonnet for the Chavistas and Maduro, and he gets rid of Maduro, but he keeps the regime, which are still a bunch of Chavistas. Um, so was he originally focused on that and then realized, "Oh, I might as well I can't do that." Like, I mean, was it always about the oil and gas, do you think? Or is it as that kind of evolved and the president realized, well, as you said, I don't want a bigger commitment. I have to make lemons out of lemonade and turn it into something else.
So the oil and gas has always been important to him because that's how he thinks. He thinks in terms of assets and resources, of control. But at one point, he was very much committed to some kind of democratic position and a recognition that regime change was important. The problem is that in the course of his engagement over time in Venezuela, I think that he had lost confidence in the Democratic opposition, wasn't convinced that they could get the job done, and to a certain extent, lost confidence in those advisors around him who had been promoting the Democrats. And I think what he fears is an Iraq like situation. And I think he recognized that the Venezuelan state is thoroughly Chavista, as you noted. The regime is still very much in place. The armed forces are still very much committed to the well being of the regime. And guess what? The Cubans are still there. Cuban intelligence officers, the people who have been working around the security of then Maduro and now Delcy Rodriguez and helping to manage the internal repressive apparatus are still very much in place. And I think the president had real doubts that a democratic opposition could be imposed on that state. without significant American military presence on the ground in Venezuela. He just was unprepared to put people on the ground. And so he had to make a decision.
So now, he's been putting pressure, as you said, on these leftist governments, Cuba, Nicaragua. Is this the end of it? Or, I feel like for Trump, it's about the oil, but for Rubio, it's about creating this kind of more friendly environment for the US in the region that doesn't have these leftists. And Rubio clearly has his eye on Cuba, Nicaragua, creating some kind of hemisphere. And Rubio's talked about this three-pronged plan, but do you think this is a one and done? Do you think they've moved on?
Listen, I think in a perfect world, the president would very much like to see political alignment in our region. I think he would very much like to see governments in place and the country that are friendly to the United States. The problem is, how do you do that? And the fact of the matter is, I think the United States is going to find its hands full with Venezuela. Although the government of Delcy Rodriguez is working to on the demands being made by Secretary Rubio and Trump administration broadly, I think these are the concessions they're making in order to survive, in order to keep American troops on ships in the Caribbean, in Caracas. And they realize that they have a certain degree of leverage here because I think they understand that the president does not want to put troops on the ground in Venezuela. Therefore, to the extent to which Delcy Rodriguez and her colleagues can meet the president's demand, make just enough concessions, they will. But I do not think they have an of being part of an American project. They consider themselves to be revolutionaries. They consider themselves to be the last of Latin America's anti-imperialists. And while they have a keen sense of survival, they're not, I think, going to just hand themselves over. In order to move on from Venezuela, in order to move against Cuba or to move against Nicaragua or elsewhere in our region, it's going to require some degree of success in Venezuela to increase the pressure and convince others in the region that this is a worthwhile project.
Yeah,
Not
let
just
me ask you about that because, you worked extensively with Colombia on counter narcotics with Plan Colombia. They have a lot of refugees. He's alienating Colombia because of his alliance with Maduro. I mean, how do you make sense of eliminating our most important security partner in the region? And what is all this doing to kind of the goodwill that several administrations there hasn't I could argue, and I'm sure you could too, that there hasn't been enough attention paid to the region, but the work that's been done has, worked towards creating this democratic hemisphere. What is all this doing to that?
well to begin with. Colombia has been one of our closest political and security partners in South America and in the Western Hemisphere. And unfortunately, the dispute currently between President Petro and President has undermined that partnership in a considerable way. Colombians recognize that they still need the United States in an important fashion. And therefore, again, they're going to make the concessions they need to in order to ensure that the relationship survives in some fashion. But and in regards to Venezuela, nobody in the region feels badly that President Maduro.
Right.
None of them really wanted to support President Maduro in any significant way because they know that he stole the 2024. However, the specter of American military intervention in South America is really frightening for most of the. They're going to try to find.
Yeah. I mean, and then the president has also talked about action in Mexico. And this all kind of fits into this national security strategy that the US wants more dominance in the region. Um, you know, I think that's, we could talk about whether this whole sphere of influence approach works, but the idea that the US is going to pay more attention in the region and a more regional approach to strengthening the hemisphere could be good, but the way he's doing it seems to me to be more imperial than kind of creating this region that is friendly and advances U.S. interests.
He sees the United States as a regional hegemon, and he sees the United States as directing and driving diplomacy and security for the benefit of the United. This is very distinct from previous presidents who had sought to create a more integrative and comprehensive approach built around democracy, built around economic growth and prosperity, built around defense of human rights, and preserving those structures in our hemisphere, whether it's the Nation of American States, the Summit of the Americas process, and others that have driven regional integration and promoted economic growth in the hemisphere. President Trump is approaching it differently. Although he is prepared to probably focus more intently on the Western Hemisphere than some of his predecessors, I think there are many people in the region who are not the purpose of the focus, which is domination.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff, said, "We live in a world that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. These are the iron laws of the world since the beginning of time." That's a pretty stark rejection of the kind of international order, rules-based international order, which I could argue needed a little updating. But can this hemispheric policy based on might makes right still maintain productive relationships with democracies in the region?
It becomes more challenging. I mean, Mr. Miller's observation is not a profound insight. And in fact, the rules based order that we talked about, the diplomatic efforts to fashion peaceful resolutions of dispute, to promote dialogue, are all about addressing that underlying reality. It's all about making the world other than the world government bang and claw, but to create productive, predictable outcomes, engagement for the country in order to promote peace. Because what Mr. Miller is proposing, of course, is kind of constant conflict and competition. And of course, he's doing so for a country, the United States, which is overwhelmingly powerful. Uh, but power doesn't resolve all problems, and power without principle is a very weak vessel, one that doesn't serve the United States well over time, because the United States has always linked its power to purpose, has always linked what it's attempting to do to some set of values that are larger than just self-interest. And this is what's being lost in the moment. And this, in many ways, is what resonates in a very negative way, not just with government, but with peoples around.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you see what happened with Canada, with all of this talk about making Canada the 51st state, which is ridiculous. Um, but it's just part of this. It's resonated so poorly with the Canadian people. There was a boycott of, you can joke about it and say, "Oh, we're not going to buy Kentucky bourbon" or things like that. But I mean, it really has resonated, whether it's in the hemisphere or around the world. This kind of Don Road doctrine of we're just going to annex the whole hemisphere and make it America.
Yeah, one of the for me one of the sad aspects of our North American policy over the past year has been stepping away from, first of all, the economic integration that we have promoted first through NAFTA and through the U.S. Mexico Canada, but also the political cooperation and dialogue that we promoted over time through the North American Leaders Summit process. That's all gone by the wayside, and relationships with Mexico and Canada have become more fraught, complicated, and confrontational, quite frankly, with lots of threats being issued by the United States against Mexico and against Canada. whether it's military assaults against cartels in Mexico or attempting to turn Canada into the 51st
Or
state
tariffs.
or tariffs. And in this way, we've really gone backwards and in a way that's harmful because Canada, the United States, and Mexico is the largest market in the world. It's bigger than the European Union. And it's one where the U.S. economy is central. And the president, because of his own peculiar way of understanding how the United States relates to the world, is uninterested in that kind of economic connectivity, and it's going to be harmful over time to us as Canada and Mexico begin to realize that the project that they dedicated themselves to, which is this integration, creating an integrated market in North America, actually makes them vulnerable, open to manipulation, and they're going to look for options elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of broaden it out, not only was the Summit of the Americas canceled this year because of all of this, chaos and kind of disagreement in the region, but the EU just finalized this Mercosur deal with South America after 25 years of negotiation. It was just going nowhere, explicitly framed as reducing dependence on the United States. So it's not just, it's actually boomeranging this Don Road doctrine of kind of trying to have this imperialist attitude is actually having an economic boomerang because countries are now saying the United States is no, and we're going to get to the EU and kind of NATO and Canada and Greenland next. But, you know, all of what Trump's doing, whether it's tariffs, whether it's political, is boomeranging back and hurting the United States economically.
It will, assuming that these things go forward. And that the degree to which we step away from free trade agreements, the degree to which we step away from our North American partners, the degree to which we step away from our European partners and our Asian partners, and believe that our economy is so overwhelming that people can't succeed without access to markets, we put ourselves in at a time risk because the world is changing, markets are changing, uh, markets are becoming increasingly important and wealthy. And we are not going to be the only attractive market in the world a decade or so. Uh, so we just have to be careful that we don't find ourselves isolated in a world that has moved beyond us, and then we have to try to catch.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, we're talking with Tom Shannon, former Undersecretary of Political Affairs and diplomat extraordinaire who spent a lot of time in Latin and South America and served as the Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere. Let's turn to Greenland because that was also, the whole idea of Greenland and this kind of Western, hemisphere idea. Um, what we've talked about the fact that, there was this defense agreement. The U.S. already has sweeping military access. Denmark just pledged close to 14 billion in Arctic security, said they'll do whatever the U.S. wants. So what is Trump trying to accomplish that he can't already do?
It's a good question, and the president himself has explained it when he says that psychologically owning is better than leasing, and he believes
A lot of
both.
people think that's true. I mean, it's not a car, but when you look at a car or rent or whatever, I mean, you think that that asset appreciates.
Yeah, but listen, but the president's been talking about Greenland even before he began his second term, and it's been part of his effort to explain his way of understanding American security in the world. And by focusing on Canada, on Greenland, and on the Panama Canal, he was making clear that what matters to him and now to us is our near neighborhood, and that American purpose should not be about ordering the world, should not be about ensuring peace and security globally, because he thinks that's impossible. That what we need to do is protect all avenues of approach to the United States, all sea lanes around North America that matter to us, and that we protect and control all major assets, especially critical minerals, rare earths. And this is why for him Greenland is so important. And in many ways, he's right in the sense of
I was
Greenland.
just gonna say, the way you describe it, it sounds quite reasonable.
And people mocked William Seward when the United States bought Alaska. And 50 years from now, people might say, well, of course, Greenland is central to global security and to North American security. Who could have ever doubted that? But that's not the issue here. The
Right.
issue is Greenland has, for about 300 years, been part of Denmark. And as you noted, in 1951, during the height of the Cold, we did a security cooperation agreement with Denmark that allowed us to position about 20,000 troops in Greenland to once again protect the United States from attack over the Arctic from the Soviet Union. And that 1951 security agreement with Denmark is still valid, still in place. And as the Danes have indicated, it pretty much allows us to do what we want to do in Greenland on the security side, while always respecting the sovereignty of Denmark and the sovereignty of the people of Greenland. But the president, by looking beyond this and insisting that Greenland has to fall within U.S. sovereignty, is creating enormous tensions within the transatlantic relationship and especially within our NATO alliance. And the question, especially at a moment in which Russia is engaged in a war in Central Europe with really significant security um, implications for all the frontline states from Sweden and Finland to Romania, and then the rest of Europe also, creating this kind of commotion for a long-term purpose when we can already gain the short-term necessity is not wise.
Yeah, I mean, th it's just like there are a long line of people that said, that these ideas are a good idea, but, no one's kind of done anything about it. Gordon Sondland, the former ambassador to the EU, was just on TV a few minutes ago, just before we started, and said he's not taking Greenland. What he's trying to do is the Trump way, which is trying to bulldoze people like he did with the NATO kind of defense sharing, to bulldoze them into waking them up that this is critical. And what he's trying to do is really just get people focused on this. Do you believe that?
I think that's part of what he's doing, but he's scaring the hell out of people in the process, and I don't think it's the best way to go about this at this point in time. And the truth of the matter is, the president and the United States have tremendous leverage in NATO right now and in Europe because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and because of the necessity of stopping the Russians at some point and not creating a bigger threat in Europe. And I can see why the president wants to use that leverage, get some kinds of concessions about Denmark. But what worries me is that his insistence over and over and over again that this is has Denmark, Greenland has to fall within U.S. sovereignty, that it has to be owned by the United States, and that he sees this as central to American security and global security for the rest of this century. And that to me sounds like a little more than just pressure.
We have a question here from Herman that says, does U.S. disregard for national sovereignty encourage nuclear proliferation? I mean, that might sound kind of, dramatic, but when you think about countries and that the U.S. is not respecting their sovereignty, does that encourage, at the very least, kind of more um, instability?
Well, I mean, the predatory behavior of large states encourages smaller states to do whatever they can. And in many instances, it is about nuclear weapons. And so the question is the United States, by doing this, becoming just another predatory state? In other words, if the United States were to move against Greenland in some fashion, how would you distinguish that between what Russia has done to you?
Exactly. I don't understand. I mean, they don't seem to have a answer to that question, but I mean it's and then like, the president is putting Vladimir Putin on his board of peace for Gaza and other states. It sounds like, the president is headed to Davos right now, and what's being talked about is that the US is upending the international order to this like my way or the highway, as we talked about before, might makes right kind of order.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure the president would say that the international order has already been up.
Well, it has, but he is upending it in a way that's like it's like a bull. The whole thing that I've always said about the president is that he's a disruptor, but then he doesn't create anything out of the disruption. He's like a bull in a china shop that just, breaks everything and walks away.
Well, this is the challenge we're going to be faced with as we head into the next 3 years of his administration and then beyond. Is what do we build next? What can we do in order to either replace existing institutions and processes or reform them in some fashion? And as you noted, there's no articulated plan for that, and that's what's worrisome at this point, because this is an administration which is remarkably transparent in the sense that
They do what they
the
say they're going to do.
president will say anything. But at the same time, it's inarticulate because it really doesn't, aside from slogans and the occasional statement of vision,
No
it does,
stress.
and that's what worries our partners, I think, more than anything else, because
Is
they
there some
don't know
strategy?
where this is going.
Yeah, we just have a few more minutes. We're here with Tom Shannon, former Undersecretary for Political Affairs, who's, spent a career really focused on the Western Hemisphere. Um, you know, the the president announced these tariffs on NATO. The Europeans are really, I think in the first term and even in the first year, they really tried to be kind of accommodating and use diplomacy. And now they're standing up to the United States. Their countries are sending troops to NATO to kind of deter the US. Um, what is, basically Denmark's prime minister said everything stops if they try by force, including NATO. Is this dramatic? Like what happens? And I don't personally think the US is going to um use force. I don't know what you think. And there really is no using force. I mean, the US could take it in an instant. Where do you think that this is going in terms of the US kind of leadership in the NATO, in the transatlantic alliance, and the moral leadership in the world? Like, play this out for me, even if they don't take it by force, and if they, both scenarios here.
Well, to begin with, in terms of our partnership, with our NATO members, I think this moment has shaken them deeply. In many ways, they have been anticipating this. I served in the first 18 months of the first Trump administration. I sat with the president at his first meeting with the German chancellor, Angela Merkel. And at the end of that meeting, the German chancellor urged to say that President Trump and the Americans had done Germany and Europe a great favor by making it clear that U.S. Security protection for Europe at a time, and that the Europeans were going to have to begin to anticipate a time the United States was no longer a security partner in Western Europe. So the Germans and others, have seen this coming for 9 years now. And even though that was interrupted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and by uh, the U.S. recommitment during the Biden administration to NATO, there's now a clear understanding that Europe has to anticipate a moment in which the United States no longer has the same kind of privileged and involved relationship with NATO, with Europe. But even recognizing this, it is profoundly unsettling, psychologically distressing, for our European partners. And even if a way forward is found on Greenland, um, uh, it's like, in a relationship in which there's infidelity, you can forgive, but you don't forget,
Right.
and
It's hard to rebuild the trust.
The Europeans will not forget.
What about in the hemisphere? Like what, we're part of this Organization of American States. We're part of this group. What about in the hemisphere? Are they going to forget?
Of course not. But listen, here's what's being lost. The hemisphere right now is quite fragmented politically, and the region itself is divided. I mean, Brazil is its own world. Colombia is headed towards um, uh, Chile has just had elections and a right wing leader was elected. Argentina had elections several years ago. A right wing leader was elected, and so it's politically amorphous right now and diverse, and it's actually a great moment to engage in debate and try to build some degree of consensus and common purpose. But instead of doing that, the United States is basically saying this is need to be great, and you guys have to provide it, and oh, good luck. Uh, and 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 some countries in the region are prepared to work with the Trump administration because they see certain advantages for them, and they believe they can protect themselves from tariffs and the rest. But others are quite appalled and aren't quite sure, how to move forward in this relationship. So we end up with a disjointed and disaggregated union. Hemisphere at a moment in which that hemisphere globalizing. China and other Asian powers have become increasingly present, not only to purchase resources, but also to build markets. And that combination of trade and investment can't be matched on the US side. And so, if we continue down this path, instead of having our Western Hemisphere as a strategic reserve that connects to the United States because of shared political values and shared economic interests, we're going to have a region that is quite prepared to step away from us. That will be harmful.
Last question, Tom. If you were still in government, at the highest levels that you were, what would you be advising policymakers on how to navigate this moment in terms of the immediate crisis management and longer term strategy for US leadership in the hemisphere and globally?
Well, first, you have to pick your fights. You can't fight with everybody. You can't threaten to invade everybody for one successful race. And I believe that historically, the United States has always understood North America as a centerpiece to its security, and that means recognizing that Canada and Mexico and the United States, although three separate countries, have a common purpose. Uh, and that in many ways, the greatest harm to our security and prosperity is being done right here in North America. How this administration is addressing Canada and how it's so. If I offered one thought, it would be um, be careful.
I have one more question. I lied. And I don't want to, obviously the kind of the issue about the texts that the president was like texting and released all these texts, talking about that he's invading Greenland because he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize or, any of those things. I mean, on one hand, you can talk about how, this is just not how diplomacy is done. But on the other hand, do you think that that kind of mindset is the truth, or is there just like this kind of Tourette's type guy that's talking all this stuff, but there's a larger method to the madness?
Well, I think the president's method is that wants to show that he is in direct communication with leaders throughout Europe on these issues, and that leaders are responding to him, but that even when they respond with concern, they respond with a degree of subservience. And he wants to show his followers and others that people still view him as the catalyst, as the one who makes decisions, sets agendas, and makes decisions, and that people then come to him to plead their case. And so I think it's all about.
It's all about power. But I'm just going to close on your line that you said earlier, which did resonate with a lot of our audience, that said, power without principle is a weak vessel.
Right.
Tom, this was an amazing conversation. We had 160 people on listening. Thank you so much. Love to have you back. And thank you to everyone for listening. And we'll see you again soon.
Thank you all very much. Wish you the best. Bye bye.